Imtiaz Dharker's Tissue takes as its subject a material which is central to so many human activities, and yet one that we so often see as disposable. Dharker said that one of the things she was exploring in Tissue was how the scraps of paper that we throw away are the things that tell the real story of our lives. And what her poem does, in a rather playful manner, is to give us so many different types of paper and examples of how it is used in daily life, that you cannot take the material for granted again. The scritter paper that is used for holy books such as the Quran, for example, paper maps, paper kites, receipt paper rolls, architectural tracing paper are just some examples. But the poem is really less concerned with paper than it is with what humans inscribe on it. It is drawing, printing, and especially writing that Dharker sees as bringing this blank material to life. In the poem's opening stanza, Dharker ponders in a disarmingly simple and candid turn of phrase the fact that this fragile material is what could alter things. Paper is thin enough, it seems, to be translucent, yet what is recorded on it can be a source of enlightenment or consolation for future readers. She gives us many examples of the kinds of human knowledge which paper preserves: family history, religious instruction, the Earth's geography, modern consumer culture, architectural designs. Yet one thing that is never explicitly mentioned is that paper is the material on which poetry is written. In spite of this, Tissue strikes me as being highly self-conscious about its own status as a document recorded on paper. I want to briefly suggest how we might read Dharker's poem as a text that is trying to teach us about poetry, both about how we should read poems and about why people write them. In particular, I want to focus on one important word in the poem, and that's the word turned. When she has spoken about Tissue, Dharker has said that it originated in finding her father's handwriting in the back of a book, and the connection she felt with him through reading his words. I think that one of the things that the poem is trying to do is to encourage its own readers to experience a similar sensation in the act of reading it. That is, to establish our own intense connection with the words in front of us. Dharker seems to be teaching us how to read, by which I mean how to read in a way that doesn't just seek to extract information from a page, but tries to establish a connection with the words on it, to delight in their sounds and rhythms, to attend to their intricacies and ambiguities. To illustrate what I mean by this, let's look at the third stanza of Tissue, in which Dharker writes of how in well-used books we find pages smoothed and stroked and turned transparent with attention. When reading Dharker's poem, I found myself returning again and again to this phrase. The polysyndeton, that is, the repeated and words, of smoothed and stroked and turned, slows down the pace of the line, as if urging the reader to linger over each word and to savour their rhythms and their sound patterns. And by using sensual verbs to depict the act of holding a book and turning its pages, Dharker suggests that paper is a material to be caressed rather than to be merely looked at, and her own language seems to encourage us to caress words themselves in a similar way. We're not meant to just extract meaning from them, but rather to take pleasure in the experience of reading, particularly in the clusters of alliteration which run throughout her poem, as they do here, and make it a joy to read aloud. Paper is a thin, translucent material, and yet the words written on it can often seem utterly dense and impenetrable. It is sometimes only by reading and rereading that words begin to reveal their meanings, to turn transparent with attention, as we continue to turn over those words in our minds. That is especially the case with the word turned in this passage, which is a particularly dense one, for it refers to several things at once. To the reader's hand turning the book's pages, to the book itself turning, worn, and frayed as it is read, and also to how the text's meaning turns transparent for the reader, how we begin to understand it. The poem doesn't want us to take paper for granted, but it also doesn't want us to take words for granted either. It wants to show how they can delight and baffle us in equal measure. Dharker's poem is a difficult one, which demands to be smoothed and stroked and turned by a reader, rather than being easily understood. Establishing a connection with her text requires that we pay it due attention. But her poem also tries to teach us how that experience of reading, that bafflement, is also part of the fun. For example, it's a poem, as I said, that's a joy to recite, on account of the sound patterns that we get from its clusters of alliteration, and also from the internal rhymes in each stanza. This and is in stanza 1, kind and find in stanza 2, wait and dates in the third stanza, and so on, which draw the reader on from one line to the next, even if there isn't a regular rhyme scheme in the poem. These ideas about how we should read poetry, I think, offer one way of interpreting the final enigmatic lines of tissue, in which the phrase I've just analysed returns in a slightly modified form. Paper smoothed and stroked and thinned to be transparent, turned into your skin. The poem's conclusion suggests that it is through that process of reading and rereading, as if smoothing and stroking the words on the page, that we can achieve a kind of intimate understanding of the text, a deep connection that can make the poem appear as if it is our own skin, a part of ourselves. But these lines refer not only to reading, but also to the act of writing, I think. They celebrate poetry's own capacity to turn one thing into another through the sheer force of literary language. After all, paper has only turned into skin here because of the poet's ability to make us think about it as such, because of her ability to take an everyday object such as paper and transform it, turn it into a metaphor for humanity. And the power of poetry to make us think in these ways is acknowledged in one further meaning of the word turns that Dharker is playing with here, I think, by placing the word turns at the beginning of the line, the point at which one line of poetry turns into the next one. As the Oxford English Dictionary notes, the origin of the word verse is actually from the Latin word vertere, meaning to turn, on account of how each line of poetry turns back at its end to begin the next one. In both quotations from tissue that are on the screen here, Dharker places the word turns at exactly the turn of the line, playfully drawing attention to her own poem's formal artifice, its line breaks. Like the architect who's referred to in the final stanzas of her poem, Dharker herself is a kind of builder, one who eschews brick or block in order to trace a grand design through poetry. And her construction is at its most intricate in that final turn of the line. Here, at the poem's close, its form and language mirror each other perfectly, as that final turn from one line into the next coincides with the metaphorical transformation that has been building from the poem's outset, as the page becomes turned into an extension of our own bodies.